Who's your how have they not been fired coworker, and what have they done to earn that title? I worked for a company that tested soil samples for mining companies. Each test had to be given 0.002 grams within 0.0001 grams of a white substance. I can't remember what it was called. The company won a massive contract and there was a lot of work to be done, too much for the lab, so they started falling behind. The manager/accountant told everyone that to speed things up, they were to put in 0.02 grams within 0.005 grams instead. Do you know how long it takes to measure out 0.002 grams? But the results all came back wrong, and the mining company wasted $300 million mining for copper, which wasn't there. They successfully sued us. 300 people lost their jobs, which was 50% of the company's workforce. The manager who made the bad call didn't lose his job, as he denied telling everyone to make the gram change, even though there were about 30 witnesses who said he told them directly. I started work at this company about 2 years after this event. I have never heard so much cruelty and vitriol about a person as I did about this manager. Nobody in the company had any respect for him and treated him with absolute disdain. There were signs on the doors of some labs telling him he was banned from entering. People used to tell him to F off in the corridor as they walked past him. I tried to stay neutral, but when I heard what happened, yikes, that dude knew something really bad about someone high up in that company, huh? Story 2. I work in a hospital. She frequently touches patients with unclean gloves. She unleashed gas so bad in a patient's room that the patient actually asked her to leave and not return to their room. Aside from that instance, she has been removed from numerous patients' rooms for a variety of reasons. She doesn't manage her time well at all and fails to get her assigned patient baths done. Most recently, she was caught touching a patient with a known communicable disease without gloves, and she was interacting with an unclean specimen collection pan from the same patient, again, without gloves. I felt bad for her at first because it seemed like everyone mercilessly bullied her, but she sort of deserves it at this point. Story 3. I work in corporate America for a Fortune 500 company. I have too many stories to tell, but one stands out. At the corporate headquarters in an $80 million building, there was a master electrician who had been there for 40 years and knew where all the bodies were buried. I installed a bunch of UPS dual backup offline battery systems in 40 server closets at about $5,000 each. The units required a 30-amp breaker and receptacle with the correct gauge wiring. The master electrician changed my specifications without saying a word and called for 20-amp breakers since that's what was already there and available. After my install was complete, he went back in, cut the 30-amp cable ends off the UPS systems, and installed a 20-amp hub bell. Now, the UPS units wouldn't provide maximum runtime under a load, and he had voided the warranty on $200,000 worth of UPS systems. That individual spent a month arguing with higher-ups that his opinions superseded physics, and I finally got the manufacturer to send a "you bought it, you name it" letter. I eventually had to yank all 40 units, replace the correct cable ends, and get a sign-off from the manufacturer that they would still honor their 5-year warranties. Problem solved. 3 months later, at the same site, a $400,000 end loader went missing. It vanished. It eventually showed up at the master electrician's farm, parked in the back 40. He explained that he took it home to do some maintenance despite having no heavy machinery experience and staying silent while everyone was frantically looking for the end loader. No one fired the guy. 2 months later, he was arrested for his third DUI, and the C-suite crowd intervened with the courts and cops, so he got probation. He kept his job for another year and then retired with full benefits and a huge pension. Story 4. My boss at Walgreens, when she took the position from the prior shift, she promptly canceled the overnight shift, which was a problem because that was when we got things like cleaning and restocking done. She then funneled those responsibilities onto the evening shift but didn't increase their staffing numbers. Instead, she fired people on that shift for having the audacity to use vacation time. So even though the store had a 3-employee minimum, we often had 2, occasionally dipping down to 1 if, for any reason, the other person couldn't make it in, like being sick. Even if both people were in, it wasn't a small store and they were expected to clean and restock it while dealing with the large amount of customers that only trickled off around 9 or 10 p.m. Since the store closed at 11 p.m., that only left about 1 hour when everything had to get done, and there were still customers, just not as many. She then routinely ignored vacation time requests even if they had been filed months in advance, threatened people with firing if they didn't come in while sick, and pestered any employee who wasn't working with 100% uptime. So if you, say, took a moment to sit down because you had been on your feet for 8 hours, or if you weren't facing the store despite seeing a customer coming up to check out, she'd get furious. It was next to impossible to avoid write-ups, her chewing you out, ignoring requests and everything, at least if you weren't on her shift. Oddly, not only was her shift always properly staffed, but every employee on it got a favorable review complimenting their quote-unquote hard work, even if they were entirely inept. My boss's boss worked at another Walgreens nearby, and I got sent over to help with the Halloween rush. He was utterly baffled at how the lazy and inept employee had completely restocked the entire store and cleaned it, leaving no work to be done 2 hours before the shift was scheduled to be done. Even when I explained to him what was going on, he didn't believe me. When I finally moved away and had to quit, she asked how much time I needed off and said she could give me 2 weeks at most. I laughed and told her I was giving her my 2 weeks notice. My sole regret is that now, 4 years later, I had to move again, and the only large employer in the area is a different Walgreens, and I'm too scared to apply because they'll probably have me on file, saying I did a bunch of horrible stuff. Story 5. I work in a cash-based industry with someone who refuses to lock her cash drawer. When I pointed out to her that she is on camera and could get fired for stepping away from her cash drawer without locking it, she said, "Well then, I'll just pretend." The camera can obviously see that the drawer is unlocked. She also keeps offering to search the building with her gun, which she is absolutely not allowed to have on premises every time there is a security issue, because she wants to shoot someone. Needless to say, we tell her no. She once credited the wrong account because the account number on the payment didn't match any of the account numbers we had. The person had transposed some digits. Instead of looking up the customer or contacting any of her coworkers, she just punched in random numbers until something popped up and credited that random account. She then blamed the people whose account she credited, people who had nothing to do with the payment and who were honest enough to tell us that they had been mistakenly credited, for giving her the wrong account number. She once asked me if an email was domestic or international, and if it was international, what she would have to do to send an international email. She is genuinely surprised that no one else agrees with her racist views. She makes constant, loud, personal phone calls about private things that no one needs to hear, especially as we are not allowed to have our phones out while working due to security and privacy issues. She drinks exclusively energy drinks and cannot figure out why she has severe stomach issues. She keeps going to her car to grab something every 15 to 20 minutes as if we can't see through the large glass window to the parking lot that she's a chain smoker, and is the reason our nice flower garden is full of cigarette butts. She will talk to people as if they are in the middle of a conversation with her even though they have just arrived or are walking by, and will continue that conversation for 5 to 10 minutes after the person has left. Story 6. When I worked in a nursing home laundry room, my coworker literally refused to do the job she was hired for. She actually told the supervisor she wasn't going to do it. Not only that, but she didn't do anything else either. She spent more time on the smoker's porch than in the laundry room. She drove her friends home while she was on the clock. She refused to pick up the soiled laundry more than once or twice per shift, even though she was supposed to pick it up 4 or 5 times. People would tell me that they didn't see her for hours at a time and quite often question whether she was actually there or not. She once called the supervisor and told her that she wasn't coming in to work that day because she was too intoxicated. She was also working in the nursing home kitchen and would leave the laundry room to go to work there because they paid her more. Even after she was told multiple times to change into clean scrubs before going into the kitchen, she would still wear the scrub she had on while working in the laundry room, then go into the kitchen to prepare food. This woman got the same evaluation score and the same raise that I got, even though I was doing 99% of the work. Story 7. An older individual in his 60s had been caught screaming at coworkers multiple times, has been banned from entering 3 of the buildings we're supposed to work in, one of them 3 times, screamed at and threatened to harm a female worker because, quote, she reminded him of his mother, when all she did was silently walk by. He even admitted to everything he said in the police report, physically grabbed a female coworker and shoved her out of a room with a witness, overhearing everything over the phone, constantly accuses everything of being woke, always goes on long-winded rants and conspiracy theories about how women only exist to have kids regardless of other workers or the general public being around to hear him, and simply doesn't do the job he's paid to do at all. But it's okay, he has bipolar disorder, so there's nothing wrong with it. When I first got into federal government work, I was told I'd never be fired for anything short of termination. Like everyone else, I rolled my eyes, thinking it was just an exaggeration. I'm now telling you all that a federal employee will never be fired for anything short of termination. Story 8. I work for a hospital. A few years ago, I transferred out of scheduling and into a different area of the hospital, radiology. Before I left, they gave me a new hire to train as my replacement. My specific job in scheduling was to transcribe paper orders from doctors' offices outside of our hospital system into our EMR software and the patient's chart, and then call them to set up appointments for any outpatient testing, imaging, cardiology, etc. This job required more medical knowledge than some of the other scheduling jobs, since those roles were working from orders that were already entered correctly into the patient's chart directly by the ordering doctor. The way outside doctors would order things often didn't 100% match how exam names were worded in our computer system, so I'd have to do some interpreting based on an understanding of the tests and medical terminology. They gave me this specific new hire because they thought she had medical experience. I was told she had been an office manager for a doctor's office. It turns out she hadn't worked in a doctor's office at all, but in a dental office. A big difference. Teeth are like the one thing hospitals don't work on. She had no knowledge of human anatomy outside of the mouth. She could barely name organs, let alone know where they were or what they did. Aside from that, she was just generally incompetent. She said she'd been let go from her managerial position because the dental office did a lot of downsizing during lockdown. I imagine she was just equally incompetent there, and they used lockdown as an excuse to get rid of her. After only a couple of days, I went to the scheduling boss and asked for someone else to train, saying that this new lady just couldn't do the job. That's when my boss said, "But she has medical experience." And I had to break it to the boss that it was only in a dentist's office, prompting a big face palm from the boss. But they didn't have anyone else for the job, so we were stuck with her. Still, I had a couple more weeks to train the new lady, so I did my very best. I provided her with lists and resources. I wrote out medical abbreviations for her. I explained to her over and over again that when a doctor orders an RUQ ultrasound, it means right upper quadrant of the abdomen, and that in our specific software we had to enter it as a limited ultrasound of the abdomen and just specify in the free text area that it was an RUQ. Still, every time she came across one, and there would be multiple per day, she would stop and ask me what it meant. She had shoved all the notes and resources I'd given her into a binder and never looked at them. She just asked me instead, but it was about to mostly not be my problem anymore, so I did my best and then went on to my new job. Of course, in my new job in radiology, many of our patients ended up being scheduled by her, so I still had to deal with her mistakes. She'd schedule the wrong tests, give the patient the wrong instructions, and so on, and she never seemed to get in trouble for it. When we'd catch her mistakes, we'd call her and she'd apologize profusely and say she didn't know and would never make that mistake again. But I knew she knew better because I had taught her those specific things. Fast forward 3 years, and she still hasn't learned. She's still making errors with patient orders and appointments. Most recently, she scheduled a patient for a regular CT scan when the ordering doctor actually wanted the kind of CT scan where we inject contrast directly into the patient's spinal canal rather than just into an IV. She realized at nearly the last minute and tried to cover up her mistake by changing the appointment to the correct test about an hour before the patient was to arrive. She didn't call to tell anyone. Luckily, our department saw the test pop up on the schedule and we all went, "What the heck?" Because those procedures have to be planned in advance. When we're going to be injecting people's spines, we like to have a bit of a notice so we can make sure we have a doctor, interventional radiologist that can do it, and a nurse available. There's also a special prep for the patient, so we called her and her excuse was that she didn't know it was like a regular CT scan. It has the word intrathecal in the test name, and yes, a layman might not know what that word means, but if you're going to be involved in planning patient care, you should probably not be a complete layman and at least try to learn the language. Story 9. It's been a few years, but I worked at a warehouse where a 19-year-old kid taught me how important it is to be liked, more important than working hard. He, our lead, and our supervisor would leave early in the shift to get intoxicated and would only come back to clock out. The only reason they didn't do that every day is because he would miss 2 or 3 days of work every single week. I was a hard worker who basically picked up the slack even for our supervisor. I voiced my complaints, but they never cared. They'd get so intoxicated that sometimes our supervisor would call us and we'd drive out to them to drive them back to their places. Eventually, the kid took a position in another area for about 50 cents more and got fired after a week. The supervisor who got intoxicated with him got promoted, and then the lead who would join them got his supervisor position even though I was more qualified. I learned my lesson and left. Story 10. We have a night shift worker who has repeatedly had complaints filed against him for aggressive behavior and verbal cruelty. A lot of people refuse to be scheduled on the same shift as him. He calls out a lot at the last minute, leaving us scrambling to fill his shift. When he does show up, he often just won't do the work and will leave it sitting for 12 plus hours for the morning shift. He will also go out of his way to make a huge mess, literally smearing things on tools just to force people to clean up in the morning. He also likes to send really passive-aggressive, hypocritical emails and leave nasty notes for people. And yet, somehow, he still works here. Sometimes I ask people what they'll ride in the car that gets passed around if he ever leaves without being fired, and the general consensus is that nobody will bother because we know we won't write anything on the card. Story 11. One person calls in 3 days a week and it's just unpleasant to everyone. She makes things more difficult than they should be and goes to our supervisor anytime someone breathes the wrong way. Somehow she got bonuses just for doing her job, yet when I covered for her, it was the first time someone's room had been cleaned in months. Another person used to be treated with kid gloves by the former bosses, so the one time she was written up for something, she took the day off afterward. She has emotional problems that no one wants to set off. Personally, I don't care because I just roll my eyes. She doesn't do any extra detailed work. Story 12. At a previous job, the CFO was the CEO's brother, so he had a quote-unquote get-out-of-jail-forever card. Here are a few highlights. He would insert himself into projects he was not a part of and would arbitrarily shorten deadlines, penalizing the team. 2 examples of this pretty much destroy the company. The first project, which I was a part of, was to make a self-service kiosk for license plate renewals. The original deadline was from September to August. The project manager assigned the necessary development people and got the hardware team on board. Work began and progress was going smoothly. The stand-up meetings showed great progress. The hardware passed testing and was compatible. The back end was coming along great and the front end needed a little work. The manufactured prototype was slated to be completed on March 15th, so we would have an actualized system to test on. March 15th came and the prototype wasn't quite ready. It would be in on the 17th, which wasn't a big deal since the deadline was in August. At the stand-up meeting on the 18th, the CFO was there. He said, "All right, why in the heck is the prototype just now getting unloaded? This goes live on April 15th. Literally everyone, including the project manager, turned at once and said, "What in the heck are you talking about? The contract states August." The CFO replied, "Well, I just changed it." A month of scrambling ensued. The front end was a mess, and the back end had some catastrophic issues that could cause the entire system to collapse. At the April 10th stand-up meeting, this was expressed. The CFO said, "Not my problem. Oh, and we need to change several key components as we now want the ability to use dumb card swipes." So now the hardware and software both had to be changed to accommodate dumb card readers. The mess that was delivered on April 18th was 100% the CFO's fault. About 3 front-end developers and 5 back-end developers quit at that point. A stable version of that system wasn't ready until August, but the CFO shipped it out in April to make it look like he gets stuff done. He shipped a box full of junk. The second project was a full rewrite of the main software, and the project deadline was 2.5 years out. The CFO pulled the same trick, cramming it down to 9 months. That project lost the entirety of the back-end team 4 times. This means there was no one left on the team, and they had to hire all new people who had to figure it out because there was no one left to train them. That project was eventually scrapped entirely, and $7 million was pretty much set on fire for no good reason. The company was bought out, and the new company's first order of business was to fire the CFO. And if any of these stories are getting to you too, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 13. No one knew how Frank kept his job. Frank and I were both in tech support, a fairly low-level job, but at least it was internal tech support rather than dealing with customers. Frank took either Monday or Friday off every single week by calling in sick. Sometimes he would take both days off. We didn't have anywhere near that much PTO or sick time, but he never got in trouble for it. It wasn't clear if they were all paid days off or if they just gave him unpaid PTO after a while, but we assumed they were paid since nothing was ever mentioned and he never stopped calling in sick. You think nepotism or cronyism was keeping him employed, but we never saw any evidence of that. Honestly, he'd probably have a cushier job if that was the case. It was baffling. Story 14. I had a low-level manager who was constantly flirting with his female subordinates and outright asking a bunch of them on dates, so there wasn't really any plausible deniability. It was a widely known thing and involved a lot of women. He would even get women trained in certain positions because he was interested in them and was generally just a big creep. I think the real reason he got away with it was because it was such a well-known issue that a lot of people had the idea that he'd obviously already been reported, but nothing happened. Everyone I talked to had that impression, and it seems no one ever reported him, assuming others had, a kind of mistreatment bystander effect. It's noteworthy that a few others in management were fired for similar reported behavior, so I don't think the company was condoning the actions. I think this guy was just so open about his behavior and did it with so many women that his conduct never made its way to HR's ears because everyone just assumed it already had. He may have eventually gotten fired, but he got away with it for at least the 2 years I worked with him. Story 15. I worked for a large subsidiary that was a consistent moneymaker for its parent company. The parent company decided their stock was too low, so they mandated that our subsidiary lay off over 100 people. The boss of our CEO flew in to personally make the cuts along with his head of HR. The goal was mostly to cut older, higher earners rather than focus on cutting useless weight. I felt particularly bad for one guy in his mid-50s who was a stellar worker and had a kid in college. They also fired the guy sitting next to him who was a pretty decent hire, an absolute moron, and also wasted everyone's time with his chit-chat. I think he was on the list because his was a brand new position. This person broke down crying in front of the corporate bigwigs and explained how long it had taken him to get the job and that he didn't know what he would do. The corporate bigwig fell for it and the individual kept his job. The cuts were already a morale ender, but keeping that individual just added salt to the wound. Story 16. This person sleeps on the job. They've been known to fall asleep within half an hour of arrival, take a mid-morning nap until lunch, and have an afternoon nap. They've also slept through closing time, being left to wake up hours after everyone else has left. People drive by and report the car is still in the parking lot 2 or 3 hours after closing. As a result of their sleeping, they have produced false documentation for tasks that were not completed. They've also missed documenting things that were actually done but forgotten about. Additionally, promises made to customers are not delivered because they fall asleep after the conversation. Story 17. There was a girl who worked at the bar with me who got intoxicated every single shift. She used to scream at customers, literally scream, because they wouldn't leave after that last call. On one occasion, she ripped her top off in the restaurant while intoxicated. Another time, she randomly started smashing glasses and laughing hysterically on the restaurant floor while customers were still in the building. She also dated a bartender, cheated on him with a customer, and utter chaos ensued. I'm sure there are things I'm forgetting. She didn't get fired because the owners thought she was attractive. She was eventually fired for taking 3 customers to the office and getting into the backup liquor supply. Story 18. They eventually fired the guy, but it took months. He would sleep in the shop with his feet propped up, arms folded over his chest, and his chin down. Multiple pictures were taken of him sleeping. He stole from the pantry and from housekeeping, and he probably stole from the maintenance shop too. He also took the shuttle for joyrides and would put upwards of 40 miles on it a night. He even went into the pool shed and slept. He adjusted his time to get more hours by never actually clocking in and instead using time adjustment forms, claiming he was there 2 hours before he ever showed up. He was constantly walking around on his phone or standing at the TV in the lobby watching football. I was so glad when they finally fired him. Story 19. I'm a bank teller and I trained this woman about 3 years ago. She went through all the training modules 3 times and still didn't understand our teller system. Our system is so painfully bare bones that it literally has a button for deposit, loan payment, or cash check / withdrawal, etc. For the record, I never had an issue with anyone else I've trained. There are some growing pains obviously, but nothing like this. She committed constant policy violations like straight up leaving cash around, having massive amounts of cash in her drawer, depositing into wrong accounts, and even taking money out of the wrong accounts. She also gave incorrect amounts of cash, even though we literally have a machine that dispenses cash for us. She's a mess. Anyway, she recently got a promotion to a banker position. That's unbelievable on its own, but she also got supervisor capabilities. When you have those, you can override your own transaction. So, for example, if there's a difference or a transaction needs to be reversed, you can override it and override those who don't have supervisor numbers. She has already overridden herself 3 times. One was to avoid a transaction after she had already given the customer a receipt. She said the check was stale dated because they had put 23 instead of 24. So she avoided it and called the business customer to say, you need to come get this whole deposit, 13 checks plus cash, instead of just letting the check go through or just depositing it without that particular check. The customer came in days later. The customer's count was $1,000 and my coworker's was $915. They deposited the checks and moved on. The customer called an hour later and said they were getting a discrepancy because there was cash in the original deposit. Well, she didn't take the cash out of her drawer originally. She was over $64 on the day of the original transaction. The next time she had her drawer out, she was over by $21 for a total of $85, which she should have been off on the day of the transaction, not $64. None of us knew any of this because she can override her own transactions. She either A, can't count, or B, broke up the difference over 2 different days. Neither of those are good options. She's also been leaving cash around again. Fun stuff. Story 20. I think my days at this job are numbered. I feel terrible, but my heart isn't in my work anymore and it's so high pressure that it consumes all my energy just to fake it. The alternative feels like losing everything as I find myself without any sort of backup plan and feel disconnected from the world. My life revolves around the job I can't stand and I have no fulfilling meaning otherwise due to mental health struggles and the isolation of moving to a new city where I'm struggling to make friends. My coworkers are much better at faking passion for what we do and they're better at juggling work-life balance. Most are older with families in their 40s and up while I'm single and alone. The younger new team members aren't jaded and have a clear strategy for their next steps after this job. It's an everyday battle not to lose myself just to get through the bare minimum of my job. I'm burnt out. Story 21. I worked with an engineer at a large telecom company, Charter. I have over 20 years of programming experience, mostly in database technology. I was hired to work with this guy who was old school like me but had 10 years of systemic knowledge in the company, which is a huge asset. My first few weeks were fine, but we started to butt heads. All of my ideas were dismissed while his were presented as the only way to do things. And that was fine. I redesigned a huge data warehouse for their financial systems. He took my design, implemented it, which was a months-long process, and to our surprise, it worked, although we had to square peg, round hole a lot of the components. It was my design from the start. He took the credit for it, but I really didn't care all that much. A bit later, our mutual boss took me to lunch and told me that the engineer was constantly bad-mouthing me to anyone who would listen. To my face, he was fine, though abrasive at times, and usually only when I pushed back on his ideas. The funny thing is that this lead engineer was also bad-mouthing our boss to anyone who would listen. Basically, this guy was toxic. Everyone was terrible to everyone else, and he did nothing but badmouth everyone to everyone, but never to their face. The problem was that he had been around for a long time and knew all the systems, so they couldn't get rid of him. Our boss, who had been with the company for 17 years, was laid off. The toxic engineer celebrated. He actually told the boss to get lost in a meeting once, right in front of everyone. A year later, I was laid off during Charter's annual layoff purges. I know it was mostly because of him bad-mouthing me and everyone else around him. He's still there, complaining about everyone and making the environment toxic. Don't get me wrong, he's a very smart guy and knows a lot about the systems within that company, but he is so short and unpleasant with everyone. He'll get fired at some point and we'll find something else, but he is taking so many people down with him and driving so many people away. It's just crazy how toxic he is. Story 22. I used to work for one of the largest chicken producers in the Middle East. In chicken farms, we had strict biosecurity protocols because the birds are so fragile and close to each other that infections can spread rapidly. We use separate trucking fleets for each of the 16 farms, which is an important detail. During peak season, logistics were slow, demand was high, and buyers were complaining. So the division head waived the biosecurity protocols and allowed any truck into any farm for the sake of speed and convenience without proper decontamination at entry and exit. Then bird flu hit the farms. By the time it was detected, after a 14-day incubation period, instead of being contained in a single farm, it had hit all 16 farms, since they were using a common fleet, and ended 100% of our chickens, approximately 2 million birds. The business suffered catastrophic consequences. The business lost $20 million in capital expenditures, capex, in 2 weeks. The entire gene pool of selective breeding over a decade was gone. Suppliers moved to competitors, and we still haven't won them back after 4 years. Market share plummeted to zero. The insurance company found the business was at fault and didn't pay out. The business head was transferred to a corporate role and makes the same pay for much less work. How? I'll never know. Story 23. I used to work at Nordstrom as a jewelry sales representative. I also used to help out in the handbags and accessories area. In the accessories department, there was a salesperson who would open at least 5 Nordstrom cards a day. Nordstrom cards were not easy to persuade someone to get. A good salesperson was lucky to even get 3 a week. During one of our How's the Company Doing meetings, that salesperson was ranked number 1 in the company for getting the most cards open. Everyone at the meeting was in shock at how many the salesperson was able to get. One day, I worked alongside that salesperson, and the manager asked him to show me how he got so many Nordstrom cards. I hesitantly agreed. Later that day, a customer wanted to buy a pair of sunglasses from me. At the end of the purchase, the salesperson came over to help me persuade this customer to open a Nordstrom card. The salesperson said, "Oh, let me see if I can help get you a 15% off your purchase today. All I need is your ID or driver's license." The customer looked at me, and I looked at the customer in disbelief. The customer gave him their driver's license, and the salesperson guided them through all the questions on the keypad. I could tell that the customer was very uncomfortable with this. At the end, the salesperson said, "Okay, congrats, you saved 15%, and handed him all the documents for his purchase. Not once did the salesperson tell the customer that they were opening a credit card. I was in disbelief. This had to be illegal. After the customer left, I confronted the salesperson and said, "Did you just open a credit line without telling the customer?" He replied, "Yeah, it's no big deal. I do it all the time." I was shocked that this guy was doing something illegal all this time. I went to my manager and told him what the salesperson was doing, and I wanted nothing to do with it. I requested that the purchase be removed from my commission and given to the salesperson. The manager at the time shrugged it off and ignored me. I couldn't believe they were letting this salesperson get away with it. After that evening, I made the decision to quit the next day. I couldn't work for Nordstrom anymore because of their negligence and this salesperson's manipulation of people. Story 24. He was eventually fired, but not as quickly as he should have been. When I was lead server at my last restaurant job, basically a server with management capabilities, one night my fellow lead server allowed his girlfriend in after closing. They got into an argument, and he proceeded to corner her while screaming and gesturing aggressively. The only other employees in the building were 2 women who seriously feared for their safety in that moment due to his aggression. I saw the security footage and no longer wanted to be alone with him. It took all of the women on the management team coming together to convince the owners that he couldn't work there anymore. Story 25. She came from a wealthy family with a business related to the same industry as the company I worked for. She was suspiciously appointed as a director for customer experience in charge of over 300 people. She was arrogant, stubborn, lacked people skills, and treated everyone like inferiors, which was in stark contrast to the company's reputation for taking care of its employees. She made the most foolish decisions. Nobody understood them. Her team gave her feedback, but she dismissed all of it, showing a total contempt for everyone. Clients hated her team hated her peers despised her. All the numbers went down with not a single KPI in the green. Clients punished the company on the surveys, leaving her with absolutely no results to show for herself. Yep, there she was, 2 years later, belittling every single employee and client and losing the company's money and reputation. But hey, she's cooler than all of us just because she drives a Tesla and I don't. Story 26. They didn't get fired, but they no longer work there. They literally did no work and used company resources for personal use. Management refused to hold them accountable or give them deadlines for deliverables. Plenty of people can fly under the radar with low productivity, but what set this one employee apart is that they infested our office with bed bugs. We started finding a bed bug here or there crawling across the desk and the cubicles near theirs. Then we were finding them regularly in their cubicle and even crawling on them. It was several years of hell until HR took our complaints seriously. Luckily, most of us who weren't in the vicinity did field work and just avoided being in the office as much as possible. I fully believe anyone who says that bedbugs cause PTSD. Story 27. I haven't even been at my company for a full year. One of my supervisors has already received over a dozen complaints. We just lost one of our lead staff members, and they stated in their resignation that it was due to the supervisor creating a hostile work environment. She was responsible for firing our only black employee, who was there on a government contract from a federal agency that was providing us with this employee out of the kindness of their hearts, because he professionally told two of our employees that their seniority at the company didn't supersede his master's degree in the field he was teaching in. He also told them they needed to stop trying to change the federally written and mandated curriculum he brought with him. They had to hire an additional supervisor because several of our staff members refused to work with her. She has zero idea of what a professional tone is, no idea how to properly delegate tasks, and zero ability to take responsibility for her own gigantic mistakes. The one time we ever received an email apologizing for a mistake, we printed it out and tacked it to a wall in a closet she never goes in. How she has not been fired yet is beyond me, but she does not belong in a management position whatsoever. Story 28. I work in a large national chain. One of my coworkers comes from an ultra-conservative branch of Christianity. I haven't personally caught him yet, but the stories I've heard from coworkers about him being blatantly sexist, racist, and homophobic have me always listening when he enters my department. One coworker told me he heard this guy engaging in inappropriate behavior in the restrooms. He couldn't prove it to management because that would be an invasion of his privacy, so my coworker just turned the lights off and left. I look forward to the day we inevitably see this man getting walked out of work. I have no doubt in my mind he'll say the wrong thing to the wrong person and get fired. This is incredibly ironic given his religious beliefs of quote-unquote love. Story 29. I work with a guy who is incapable of following the very specific coding requirements we're given. Our project managers provide us a list of numbered requirements for specific enhancements, new features, and bug fixes. If we follow the requirements step by step, we'll meet their requests. This guy, however, will just start coding without following the requirements. As a result, his code fails every single peer review without exception. If we're lucky, he'll get it right on the second round of reviews. Apparently, our boss asked him to do something 7 or 8 years ago and he got it done quickly, and because of that, the boss thinks he's some kind of coding genius. He's literally the worst coworker I've ever had. If the boss weren't protecting him at every turn, the PMs would have had him fired years ago. Story 30. I work for a streaming company. One coworker flat out lied about doing his work, claiming he completed the product requirements, talked to stakeholders, and fully vetted the solution. We know he didn't because the solution he put forth is physically impossible. It can't be built, no matter what, because the client team can't read that programming language. This resulted in a 4-month delay, and we still don't know what to do because he left on medical leave and didn't leave any notes. The tool was supposed to be used by the C-suite, but when I went to HR, they said it was a performance issue and not a fireable offense, even though he faked documents and communications. We now think we found another program where he faked everything, and the solution he's been having us plan for is also not possible. It does give me comfort that it's basically impossible to get fired here. Story 31. The finance team had done a lot of work to perfect how the financials flowed. A new controller was hired, and he in turn hired a CPA. After the first of the year, I like to review all of my reports for relevance and accuracy, and while doing so, I noticed that the chart of accounts had been changed in such a way that the flow of data was completely broken. I sent an email asking for an explanation. It turned out that the controller and CPA had been working on this change for 3 months and never told or consulted anyone. The damage was going to be bad, but since January wasn't closed, there was still time. The finance director cut his vacation short and came to the office to undo the changes. Ultimately, things were okay, but there was a permanent mark on the chart of accounts with a $0 value, and it now required special handling. With such a complete lack of communication for a major issue like that, I expected at least one firing. Nothing came of it. Both of them pulled other shenanigans with still no repercussions. I had to just avoid them to keep my sanity. They were both a complete drag on the company. Story 32. I worked at Walgreens for 16 years before I quit and moved to another pharmacy. It was a nightmare towards the end due to a terrible district manager and bad management. I was a fantastic employee, knowledgeable and reliable. I only missed 6 days in 16 years. We had a newer tech who had been there for less than a year. She was terrible, lazy, and still couldn't type a prescription even after being there for almost a year. She called out constantly, at least once a week, not counting the 2 weeks she missed for a medical procedure. She missed between 65 and 75 days in less than a year. She was rewarded with mostly early shifts, while I was rewarded with mostly late shifts. This was a major part of the reason I quit. I had a "please stay, we'll give you a raise" exit interview, but it was a case of too little, too late. I brought up her behavior, noting that the rules state you should get written up, warned, and then terminated after missing 10 days in a year. She should have been fired at least 5 times. She later quit on her own about a month after I left. Story 33. I used to work at a Jersey Mike's. At first, she was fine. She had a tougher personality, but she took great pride in her job. Then she started bringing her kids to work and letting them play in the kitchen while we were working and closing. Not only was that a health hazard, but there were also knives and slicers in the kitchen. We're talking about a 4-year-old. She straight up told us, if he bothers you, just hit him. I regret not reporting her to Child Protective Services. At one point, she was fired for leaving in the middle of her shift, but it turned out she was just transferred. She was then transferred back to our store about a month later. After I left, she stole around $2,000 and left. And if any of these stories got to you too, here's more for you. YouTube thinks we're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video.